I spent well over 20 years in an industry that sees more business emergencies than probably any other. And so, time to talk about that today. How do companies in oil and gas survive in an industry that sees things like the Deepwater Horizon, that sees events like what's happening today in the Middle East, around Iran and the Gulf, what's happening in Venezuela? These companies also see business emergencies on smaller scales or on scales that don't make it to your TV screen. But it is true that they have that kind of upheaval in day-to-day operations almost every day somewhere in their organization. I'm not saying that these companies have figured it all out or that they are fabulous and fantastic and they're doing everything right. But there are elements to what they're doing that might be worth something to those of you in other industries today. So I'm going to talk about those. I'm also going to talk about some of the things they do that I clearly see as being ineffective in these situations or actually detrimental to their efficiency and their success. And we're going to talk about those too, because some of these might also be recognizable or building in your organization. So let's get into it. Leadership today isn't just about scaling. It's about navigating constant uncertainty, market disruptions, and high-pressure decisions. If you're dealing with chaos, bottlenecks, and relentless pressure, welcome to the Business Emergency Room. I want to start with 5 things to potentially take away from the oil and gas industry. The one I want to start with is the front-end loading that happens. What these companies typically do very well when they make decisions is that they decide slowly. And you hear a huge hesitancy from me when I start to say decide slowly, because that doesn't sound like anything I would normally say. What do I mean by that? They decide slowly and they execute reasonably fast. What I mean by that is that they spend more time in the decision-making process and they go wider, they work very thorough, and any catastrophes are, insanely expensive. Failure is expensive. This also applies to the space industry, for instance. And yeah, if you're thinking of an oil well in West Texas, a failure there in a single well is not the same expensive as an issue with a well that cost well over $250,000 in the Gulf of Mexico or in any other deep water arena, right? Or in frontier space, or when you're working country entry and the trust with all the partners involved and you're working with national oil companies, etc. The trust is still building. You cannot afford to mess that up because that's not just an investment in that project, it's an investment in what's supposed to be a long-term relationship. And so front-end loading in the decisions you're making, in the decision whether to enter a country, whether to enter an opportunity, whether to make the next stage of the investment decision, is a slow decision-making process. And I think that many organizations could do more of that. What it really means is that you're making a lot of small decisions, but sometimes these decisions are okay. Yes, we like this part. We would make that decision to do it in this context. But now the question is, how would we execute it? And let's theoretically work through that execution plan before we actually say yes or submit a bid, right? Can we actually now indeed do that for this money before we say yes, that we will go in there? So it's the scenario and the study work that happens, which I think is very relevant. And if you do that well, it still makes you nimble, and it makes you nimble in the execution because you've done so much more work beforehand that when the situation actually unfolds and you get progressive insight on the ground in the actual situation, you probably know very well immediately how to adjust to that because you've worked through parts of that scenario before. Take 2 to take away from these major international oil and gas companies. They do something that you could call pre-mortem. Basically, they war game failure before it happens. There is so many exercises that happen inside oil and gas companies that actually go through the exercise on paper. I'm not entirely sure it's still on paper in this tech world, but you know what I mean, right? So we used to drill the well on paper exercises. There's also HAZITs and HAZOPs, which are risk and hazard identification processes. It's running through an execution plan, having all the relevant parties around the table and actually going through the step by step, not by people in their silos, but together. And there is inevitably in these exercises things that come up that the left hand didn't know about the right hand planning to do that, or now is starting to understand about how the right hand actually would do that in practice. That leads to optimization, that leads to time savings, that leads to, yes, for sure, also hazard and risk reduction. But the value increase you typically see from these exercises is just as major as the risk reduction. There is so much to be said for people understanding beforehand how this is going to work and have some idea of what the other players in the game are going to be doing and how they operate. Because not everybody in this game is playing the same sport. In disaster response, this is actually also very real. And so it happens in other industries. I do think not enough of it happens in fast growing tech these days and in smaller companies. And it's important because especially if you don't have standard operating procedures yet, or if you are new to collaborating with partners or the people in your business and you haven't executed a lot of things together, you're not speaking the same language. You don't have a shared language yet. So actually working through some of these exercises on paper in the safety of a boardroom is very valuable. Take 3 of what to take away and what these companies do right. Management of change. Nothing changes informally. That sounds maybe too good to be true. But there is just, I think in general, so many and such decent discipline around standard operating procedures and ways of working. These organizations are so large. I did a travel job for one of these companies for a year and a half and visited probably well over 30 different operating units within a year, right? And although they all felt differently and they had slightly different culture, I could plug in and plug out with all of these organizations because they sort of work off the same rule book. And no, it's not flawless and there is bureaucracy in there. But compared to anywhere else I've seen, the maturity of the processes and having that structure, that means that people who come from entirely different places can work together quickly because they're problem solving through the same process. They're operating through the same process and they understand which part of the process might be different in a different location and which parts are the same. So if you then move or transition or need to help out somebody else, you just need to learn about the part that's peculiar and not all the pieces to be able to help somebody and plug in quickly. That discipline is worth a lot. And my question to you would be, how many decisions were made in your business last month that nobody wrote down and where people involved assumed that they were talking about the same thing? How much ineffectiveness did you have in your business or in any transactions you had in the last week because you realized you were not talking about doing something the same way? Or how much time did you spend in the last week actually, rather than getting the work done, agreeing with somebody how the work was supposed to be done, or reading somebody new in on how the work needed to be done rather than what work needed to be done and what outcomes needed to be generated. Take 4 to take away from these oil and gas companies. They operate in frontier conditions everywhere, right? Just like in space and yes, there is many established arenas, but time and time again, they face something new, something different. And resourcefulness still entirely has a place in these organizations, right? Whether you're in the Russian Arctic or the Iraqi desert, you cannot always call a supplier and get parts tomorrow, right? You cannot fly in the consultant because the visa process is very elaborate. So something that is not fitting the norm, I mean, the cavalry isn't coming. you have to work with what you have, you improvise intelligently, and you need to maintain forward momentum. And these are conditions, or there's things that happen that would shut down any other business, even if it happened at a much smaller scale. So somehow, despite, I talked just about all these business processes that are in place and the size of these organizations, people do feel empowered in these places to actually make things work. And so particularly in my time in supply chain, in some of these frontier projects, we've had some crazy scenarios with people or things needing to get in to get the project moving again, to get operations moving again. And so we established there's a problem. And within the project team, we would get together and we would figure out a solution. And we would still have to then put that solution past the decision makers, right? To actually, before we actually executed it. But if we'd done our work and we explained our logic and said, well, this is, we think, the most optimal solution we can come up with from a schedule and a money perspective, etc., we usually were off to the races, right? We just had to briefly summarize our logic. And yeah, sometimes that did mean that we also had to ask for extra money or extra. So the decision discipline and the change management doesn't go out of the door with it, but that space for people to understand and be trusted with what needs doing. And if I can't do it the conventional way because I've run into a roadblock, I'm going to come up with something else and propose that. That's within my remit. That's actually what's expected of me, right? And that made work also often very, very fun. So the question is, you've had that in your business where you run into a challenge and where it wasn't one person's heroic, but where somehow you banded together and made something else work, got an alternate to work. How can you grasp what happened in that moment and make it somehow more part of your business culture? Does it ever happen? Is it just something that maybe you should have a conversation with your peers and kind of say like, hey, would we do that? If we run into roadblocks, do you think our people know that we want them to start working on alternatives and have that resourcefulness? Do we cultivate that enough? Do we make that clear enough? Something to think about. And then take 5 to take away from oil and gas majors. It's the cross-functional integration as a design principle. And I think size has something to do with both the effectiveness and the ineffectiveness of this. I still think it's more a strength than a negative thing. Major oil and gas projects and organizations are engineered and structured and set up such that every discipline works from a single integrated plan with shared milestones from day one. So, and these people move in and out of these projects, right? So there's people who will be on a project for 10, 12 years. There's people who will be on a project just to help one initial decision hurdle or to help make decisions or engineer one very specific piece of kit on that major project. But they all have access to the integrated plan to the extent that they understand where their piece fits in, what the next milestones are, what the next decisions are, etc. And that level of integration, that ability to understand what drives value and what's driving the timing and who makes the decisions is so helpful in reducing the waste of time. And that also effectively creates the ability to manage change. What I also really love about that integration is that the idea is to plug in the fit for purpose level of discipline skill. So let's say if I have an engineering team, they look at the complexity and the nature of the project and the work that needs happening, and I maybe get a junior mechanical engineer assigned to the team. That junior mechanical engineer, though, has a line up in the mechanical engineering line. And when he or she is running into challenges that go a bit beyond what they can deal with, they will escalate it up their line to get that additional support. I will know for a fact as a project leader that that person will discuss the work they're doing for my project with their lead, who entirely also has the buy-in and the responsibility to make sure that if he or she as the as that individual's discipline lead sees that that person's out of their depth, that they intervene. And that is formalized through technical authority system. So basically, the integrated engineering work gets reviewed by more senior engineers and subject matter experts. And that happens not just in engineering, that happens in all the disciplines, right? So I get the caliber of support that I need on my project, but there is a backing there that's like a tangled web spreads out that makes sure that the quality and the quality gets delivered, right? And that if things get more complex, that support shifts or changes. So my question to you would be, if you have a lot of overruns and rework, or you have a lot of issues that stem from interfaces, etc., do you have some of these centrally integrated plans? Do you know if your finance people and your operations people are actually looking at the same set of business targets or project targets or operational targets? Or has everybody distilled it down to their own version, right? Because that actually matters. Is there somewhere that one central heart where it's all coming from, so that people are working towards the same thing and stand a better chance at working integrated? And if you design from the start, or if you have to work against it once things start falling apart, that's much, much harder. Of course, there's also plenty in this space that doesn't work so well. And so I want to talk about those. The things maybe not to take from this. It sounds maybe good, but I don't think it's good. My number one here is that these companies are effectively too big to fail. And that might sound really good, because I don't think any of us really see any of these companies go away, because even BP, of course, suffered after Deepwater Horizon event, but is, growing strong and steady still and again. So they come back. They're so big. And I think the big challenge around that is that immunity destroys some of that decision muscle, right? Basically, these companies are structurally insulated from the full consequences of their dysfunction for so long that unless maybe they have one of these big shockers like a Deepwater Horizon, there is massive pockets in their businesses where stuff is happening. It's just busy work, right? They are no longer good at stopping stuff, at killing projects, or admitting what has run its course. I've seen so many kind of hobby projects and busy work and recycles happening in different pockets of the organization. So yeah, the feedback loop that would force those decisions in any other business doesn't seem to arrive with enough force. And that's a lot of value loss. And so the question is really, how can you create or keep a sense of urgency in your business that forces you to shed the stuff that really isn't valuable, right? Or that forces you to keep an eye on that? How do you create a system internally that forces every initiative and project to be evaluated periodically, annually, or whatever it is, effectively enough that you catch the stuff that is not making progress and is not going anywhere, but that still gets spent time on, so that you can kill these things? How do you keep that visibility on that? Then the second thing to leave. I do think that these organizations, because of their size, at times apply kind of mega project governance to everything. So that although I do believe that there's resourcefulness in these organizations, and I explained what I love about the way that some of the assurance happens and the discipline integration happens, that is a big system. And it does mean that there is small opportunities that get put through the same rigor and maybe shouldn't. And so that's sometimes an issue of the scales being kind of no longer useful, right? The cutoffs are very big, or the bandwidths are very big, saying everything in this value needs to go through this process, and only if it's under this does it go somewhere else. and that might not be effective or updated, or you might be in a more unusual situation. I would say that these companies have also recognized that themselves, right? So a good example is that at some point, Exxon and Shell had a joint venture started a joint venture in California called ERA, and they spun that off as an independent oil and gas operator because those fields out in California needed a lean, more Six Sigma type approach to operations. They needed a completely different operating model. If they would have been run under a Shell or an Exxon operating model, these fields would not have been making the money that they have been making. And so I do think these organizations see that, but not enough. I think the real learning from this is that you need to look at your frameworks, and it works both up and down, right? If your company has grown quite substantially, are you still working it through decision-making processes that are fit for purpose for much smaller and lower risk opportunities? And do you need to have a slightly update or a slightly different framework for the bigger and more complex stuff? Or is there changes in your market, and there are segments in your market where faster decision making is needed, where maybe a bit more of a trial and error approach is needed, where you need to maybe have a slightly different approach to how things are run? Mismatches in governance, both up and down, are either too heavy or too light, is one of the most common and least diagnosed sources of organizational drag, right? And also risk, really. What else to leave? The challenge I find in these large organizations is that although I did say that these organizations typically actually have good decision-making frameworks, that's very good and valid for the big and major decisions. The problem of such a large organization where effectively almost everybody has two leads or two managers, right? Because you're reporting somewhat into a functional line, but you're also in an operating unit or a project or whatever, where there's so many layers of national companies and joint venture organizations, but there is then also overlapping corporate structures. That complexity leads to the art of the invisible non-decision, I would call it. The challenge is that there is so much which is not so clean, not so nice, or a little difficult, that then nobody makes decisions on. I've seen underperforming people kind of just being moved over to another team without that underperformance being clearly addressed or sufficiently addressed, just moving the problem because that was easier than actually addressing the underperformance and going through the rigmarole of that and who will have to be involved in it. But you also see it in things that don't logically fit anywhere, and somebody junior bringing that up and saying, what do we do about this? And knocking on 5-6 different doors, and people are sort of acknowledging that they see what they're bringing up, but also not seeing any glory attached to bringing that further up the line, and hence not doing so. And then that individual who brings the issue forward, which might be a really good challenge, fair challenge, or a needed conversation or whatever, just kind of losing the energy around trying to champion the issue, and it just not going anywhere, right? And that happens way too much. So as you're growing, you can have this kind of thing at so many different levels. If you think of your own organization, if there is difficult stuff, right? Or if people see dysfunction in your organization on the coalface and they want to bring that up, they have the guts to bring that up. Do you think in your organization they can take it somewhere? Or are there pockets in your organization where they're probably just going to find shut doors? Is it time to maybe remind people that you want to hear what they have to say? And maybe as the more senior leader, open that door and say, hey, if you see or hear things that are not right or that could be improved, and you don't get somewhere with that in your own line, feel free to come to me, right? And you can choose smartly how you word that. But are you creating the culture that the the dysfunction and the value opportunities, but also the big risks actually are made visible and come to you. What else to leave? Technical excellence decoupled from commercial reality. Basically, what I'm saying is that the average technical specialist that I used to work with, it's intriguing because I think it's particularly an issue associated with the fact that many of the employees in oil and gas companies basically start with these companies and are lifers, right? They stay there. So they've not had other roles and or worked in other environments, and you grow up in the company on a very specific career ladder, specifically in the early days. And the challenge is that I see technical excellence, and then I see people who really do not actually know how the commercial aspect of their trade works. And you saw that very well, very specifically working in the contracting space, right? Kind of this trust that, or this idea that maybe a contractor would at all times do the right thing. But if you write a bid and you say, this is what I want you to tender for, as a contracts manager, you know that people are strategizing already how to get some more money out of it, out of the changes and stuff, and qualify things very specifically. And you would go back to some of these technical folks and say, we need to tighten up what we're asking for because we're going to get played. And kind of those conversations were eye-opening because there's some really smart people there who simply do not get the exposure to the commercial side of things, meaning that you get sometimes very theoretical plans, or you get a really good spec that's not value engineered, right? And so that's where potentially then these exercises on paper did not extend to the right places and I think they happen in parts of the organization. But an example then would be to actually deal with this is to actually work through that tender process, in my example then, as an exercise on paper, and get some people in your organization to come to the table and pretend that they are the bidding party, and let these technical folks talk through what it is that they want to get from a contractor or specify in the bid, and then let them play out how they would look at that if that's what lands on their desk and how they would deal with it. I think there is work needed in that space. I don't think it just happens in oil and gas companies. I also don't think that it happens to me, I think this is something that happens everywhere. I see it everywhere. It's just this lack of integration. It's a lost in translation. It happens in oil and gas, I think, at a scale that's really major value loss. But in this day and age where everything has to move fast, and if you're working in an industry where every penny counts, you no doubt also still have extreme subject matter experts, which are extremely valuable to your company. But whatever their piece in the puzzle is, it needs some translation to the other disciplines to make sure that all the trade-offs are clear, right? That adding this one thing, which maybe was only added as a nice to have, suddenly adds 20% cost because it adds a level of complexity for whoever needs to execute it, right? Those are the things that you need to service. And are you having enough of the dialogues and the constructs to be able to do that? And then last but not least, I do think that industry also suffers severely from a not invented here insularity. They believe that, everything is complex and different and special. You can see this by the nature that most of these companies have done for decades all their technology development in-house, or kept it very closed, or managed it directly. I swim around in the startup space a lot these days, and it's intriguing how little specific oil and gas stuff there's out there, because it just gets developed in a different route. And it's not just in that space, it's in so many different ways. And it's true that I also feel that the majority of what I learned about that industry and the business, I learned whilst in it, right? The amount of training and education and stuff I received while working in that industry is insane, and I'm very grateful for that. But ultimately, being now also out of that industry, it's very clear that they're not as special or as different as they think they are. And I think they're missing an opportunity to bring in learnings and technologies and developments from other industries that are also relevant to them and that could be of value. And I do see that also in other industries. And I see it in smaller companies, and I see it in different sectors. There are some industries and sectors that are just very in their own silo and in their own business. And yeah, that's a danger, and that's a potential value loss. And I would challenge you, maybe invite somebody else in from a different industry, talk to them what you're busy with, and say, what do you know from your industry that you would throw at this? And be pleasantly surprised by what people would come up with. Again, a different view, a different world, a different perspective is always of value. And I think everybody is a lot less special than they think. So I want to be clear before I wrap this episode up, that I really do love the oil and gas industry. It gave me my career, my toolkit, my instincts for operating under pressure, and also way more stories than I'll ever be able to tell on this podcast. But I've also by now worked almost a decade outside of that industry. And there is things in there that were great, but there's also things in there that are not functional. And that's what I wanted to share today, right? I was more interested in taking the lessons somewhere else and using that expertise in other places. I believe in cross-fertilization, and I hope you do too. But there is a reason that this industry is relatively resilient. And I hope you took some nuggets away from today of why that might be. Take the 5, leave the other 5. And if you're sitting here recognizing one of the do's or don'ts in your own business right now, that's not a coincidence. These patterns don't just stay in oil and gas, right? They travel. The question is whether you catch them before they cost you. I'd love to hear which ones of these landed with you, and if you want help with any of these, because you do realize that you have some challenges in any of these spaces, you know where to find me. Until next time, thank you. That's it for this episode of the Business Emergency Room. If you are currently dealing with chaos or disruption in your business, please reach out. You can email, text, or call, and I will find a way to connect with you within 24 hours. I've helped others steer out of the storm, and I know I can help you too. Talk soon. Please like, subscribe, and share.